probably one of the most interesting and impactful things that Trump has done with his second term already is actually something that he did before he was even inaugurated, and that was taking over the negotiations when it comes to a ceasefire in Gaza. Over the last few weeks, Trump's team has been taking over negotiations and they have seemingly achieved a ceasefire. And I think the reason that they've been able to find success where Joe Biden and the Democrats couldn't is because when it comes to all the various things that are traditionally considered about geopolitics and the interest of different states, when it comes to Trump's approach to negotiating here, his only consideration is what benefits him the most. First of all, a ceasefire in Gaza is an incredibly positive thing. This video is not going to be me criticizing the fact that a ceasefire was achieved just because I dislike Trump or something like that. This is a net positive outcome that is going to result in thousands of people not being killed needlessly. What I think is very interesting, though, is looking at how Trump's negotiating tactics and his willingness to defy the norms for his own self-interests actually benefited him immensely in trying to negotiate a ceasefire here. The first thing that's probably important to understand is that Trump is, of course, a very, very pro-Israel politician. Incredibly so, as is pretty much all of his cabinet and more or less the entirety of the GOP. So this is not something that was achieved because Trump is some humanitarian that cares specifically about the struggle in Gaza. The reason that he has wrapped this up is because, first and foremost, he is an isolationist, and although he is pro-Israel, he is not so pro-Israel that he is going to let issues there distract from him achieving his domestic goals in the United States during his second term. And also, we have to consider that this achieving a ceasefire is a massive embarrassment for Joe Biden and his legacy. Joe Biden was consistently saying that he did not by himself have the power to force Israel to stop, and despite that hypocrisy, constantly working with them and supplying military ammunition. But as Trump has come into office, even before he was in office for the second time, he has managed to pressure Israel into agreeing to a ceasefire. So that is a massive blow to Biden's legacy. So how did Trump go about achieving this goal? How did he strong-arm the Israelis into agreeing to a ceasefire? Well, I think Trump's negotiating tactics are pretty well shown off in a video not too long ago that he reposted on Truth Social, where a speaker was explaining how Israel will, on occasion, manipulate the United States into getting involved in wars in the Middle East. And that speaker, in the video that Trump posted, called Netanyahu a son of a bitch. A United States president is posting videos online of a man calling the Prime Minister of Israel a son of a bitch. And I think that gives you a sense of what Trump thinks of Netanyahu personally. Trump was also deeply hurt, and he made a bit of a fuss about it in 2020 when Netanyahu was very quick to say that Joe Biden had won the 2020 election, as is factual. But you get the sense that Trump never really got over the fact that Netanyahu immediately refused to accept Trump's notions of election fraud. So we have a pretty public and open level of disdain between these two sides of the negotiating table. And when it comes to specific methods of negotiation and how he was pushing them, a very early sign of disrespect in the negotiations was when earlier this month, Trump sent his negotiator over to meet with representatives of the Israeli government, and he forced them to meet on the Sabbath, a Jewish day of religious observance and prayer. Trump's team went over there and said, no, we do not care how important this day is to you. We are going to negotiate today, and there is no room whatsoever to wiggle out of that. Come meet us now. Now, of course, you might think of that as disrespectful to Judaism, but I think from Trump's perspective, although it certainly is, from Trump's perspective, he sees that as basically setting the tone for how he expects negotiations to go, and he wants to establish that he is in charge. And on top of that, you also have to consider Netanyahu's perspective negotiating with Trump. Because when he was negotiating with Biden, he did have a bit of a deadline. He could keep the war going because he knew that Trump was likely to win the 2024 election, and therefore he could get a better negotiating partner as he saw it, someone who was more pro-Israel. But now that we're at the start of Donald Trump's term, there isn't really any leverage in terms of prolonging the conflict. And it's also worth considering what Trump is willing to do in negotiations that other people aren't. And I think a really key way to think about that is that the Israelis have always had this established norm with the United States, that being that there is constant supply and support militarily and economically, and Joe Biden certainly wasn't going to step away from that. But there is probably a fear in the back of the Israeli Prime Minister's mind, in Netanyahu's head, that if he does upset Trump and doesn't give him what he wants, then Trump is more than willing to, purely over like a personal slight or personal rivalry or just being upset one day, really change the relationship that the United States and Israel have. So I think that's really the simplest way to think about it, about why Trump could succeed in negotiating a ceasefire in Gaza. I mean, he wanted a win early in his second term and one that would embarrass Biden. He also didn't want an international conflict distracting from his domestic legislative agenda. And on the other side of the table, you have the Israelis, who have no ability to wait out the other side at this point. They can't wait another 4 years for Trump to leave office if they don't like the terms, and they have no idea how irrationally Trump could respond if they don't do what he says. Now, look, Trump is going to be a very, very pro-Israel president in his second term. He's already lifted sanctions on people in the West Bank, and it appears that he is very, very open to the idea of Israel expanding its current settlements, further taking land away from the Palestinians. But in this one specific instance, Israel's war in Gaza was detrimental to him, and he saw massive benefit in bringing it to an end. And it really is a shame, just looking back on this, that Joe Biden, if he had applied the pressure that Trump is now applying, that he could have ended this sooner. Of course, the conditions are more favorable to Trump now that he has a full term, but Biden clearly had avenues to get the Israelis to stop, but he just chose not to, whether because of ideology or a preconceived notion of how international relations should be. He never put his foot down when it came to stopping Israel. Donald Trump has achieved a ceasefire because, whether it was for his own personal gain or any motivation, Trump was willing to do things and tell Israel to stop, where Joe Biden never was.